we see what CNN does. Like, for example, CNN has this whole thing where they went and, interviewed the ACP people and put together a hit piece on them. And to me, they're clearly doing that to make the entire left look bad, not just the ACP, because how many spots have they done on the DSA, which is way bigger, and at least from like 2017 to 2019, way more influential on actual American politics on both the left and the center left. And yet there aren't special pieces on CNN about that at all. Right? So it tells you something. I know some people use this to say that the ACP is like a CIA plot, which I find like kind of funny and has absolutely no evidence.
It's because they threaten the establishment, though. That's why CNN did a hit piece against them. It's because that's who the establishment really, really fears. That's why they did a attack on them. Don't you see?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of sad in a lot of ways. I mean, that would be like the hit pieces they'd done on Alex Jones, and some of them aren't even hit pieces. But clearly that's to make the that end of the quote patriot movement look even dumber than it is. Are the over focus in like 2019, 2020, 2021 on the weirdnesses of QAnon. And if you were listening to like liberal media in 2021, you thought QAnon was going to be a new fucking religion and like it was going to run over the entire planet. And today it like doesn't exist, basically. I mean, I'm sure it still does, but barely.
Does it exist? Because like Trump's assassination would probably reinvigorate those sort of conspiracies, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like
especially the fact that he survived.
One of the things about a lot of these internet political movements seem to come and go very quickly. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, to get into it, I do think there's a whole lot of the left that just doesn't want to deal with the fact that this happens at all. I mean, people make fun of, I'm abandoning the left story, and we hear that all the time. But like, there's also got to be a realization that even if you think these people are fucked up, the fact that there's so many of them indicates a fundamental failure somewhere. And the fact that there's not, frankly, correspondingly large numbers of people who come from the right to the far left, that just doesn't happen that often. I mean, it does happen, but it doesn't happen a lot. And partly is because I think, I've been treated, sometimes I get cred for being an ex-rightist, but a lot of times I'm treated with suspicion because like, oh, if you were ever not a leftist, how are you, a person?
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with C. Derick Varn, a reoccurring guest on this podcast, someone who I'm always excited to talk to. I think you've been on 2 episodes at this point, and this will be our 3rd. And I've been on your show once, and the last episode we did was on tendencies of the left, various different left-wing tendencies. And one topic that came up was a tendency among some leftists to drift rightwards. And of course, you have a unique background, which you discussed in the last episode, being someone who actually was a former right-winger when you were young, and you became a leftist.
Yeah.
And we're going to discuss people who have the opposite experience, who are leftists and become right-wingers. There's the famous meme, which is why I left the left. You start off being a left critical person, then you go post-left, then you go anti-left, and you just become a right-winger. It is a tendency, and I think it has led to some people who are very quick to diagnose this in any single person they see that has a opinion critical of certain things on the left. And that's why I think it's important to address this dialectically, because it is a real tendency.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a real tendency, and not just now, but historically too. And I'm sure you'll tell us all about that. For some people who experience a sort of disenchantment with the left to shift rightwards, and there's many ways they can do that now. So without further ado, why do you think this is an important issue to discuss? Because we've discussed it a lot privately, and I know you've talked about it on your channel, Varn Vlog.
Yeah, I think it's an important issue because a lot of people draw what I think is false hope or false protection from intellectual genealogies, like what sectarian tradition educated you, and we're going to know your future from that perspective. And I also think, honestly, we're living in a time where right deviationism is actually pretty common, and that's usually a stepstone to either ending up some kind of normal liberal centrist or some kind of conservative with a very broad definition of what that is. The other thing that concerned me is that there's a tendency to say stuff like, oh, well, Trotskyists have a tendency to go conservative. And I will say that is true for one subsect of Trotskyism where it does seem to be more pronounced than others, and we can talk about which one that is. But if you look at the four cornerstones of former communists who became diehard anti-communist, Max Eastman, Whittaker Chambers, James Burnham, to a lesser degree, Max Shachtman, although he didn't ever consider himself a conservative, and his role on the left in America is really all over the place because he is the mentor to a lot of the people in the Young Socialist League who became Commentary Magazine. And he was also involved in the CPA, the Socialist Party of America, during its anti-communist period, which was in the 50s, where the CPA shifted to being explicitly anti-Stalinist, and which it was not initially in the 1920s. Victor Berger's wife, for example, was a member of the CPUSA while he was a senator or congressperson I can't remember what house he was in, but while he was a sitting congressperson for the Socialist Party. So that development took some time. But if you look at Eastman was kind of an SPA guy. Max Eastman, he was Canadian too. We got involved in the American socialist movement, turned on socialism around the time of World War II, interestingly. You have James Burnham, who is not just a Trot, he's a Shachtmanite initially, and we'll get into that. So they're, going all the way back, one of the first great defectors does come from Max Shachtman's specific tendency out of the USSWP, the Socialist Workers' Party, which was the Trotskyist party when Trotsky was alive, representing it in America. And then Whittaker Chambers was a member of the Communist Party of the United States, and arguably, according to some sources, a Soviet spy until 1938, when he turns coat and tries to out Alger Hiss and he whites witness. And it's interesting to me when I hear recounts of left to right, how little people mention Whittaker Chambers, but he was a Marxist-Leninist. Around 5 years ago, I started hearing the, Trots turn neoconservative, and I was like, well, a certain subsect of them do around either James Burnham or Max Shachtman, but not even all the Shachtmanites went right wing. In fact, some of them went the other direction. Hal Draper and Hal Draper's descendant, and Draper was originally part of Shachtman's tendency. They go further and further left to the point by, you deal with Hal Draper's ideological children like Ron Tabor and Wayne Price. They're both anarchists now. So that tendency tended to go in wildly different directions. The other thing that belies is both the Orthodox Trots and the Marciite Trots. The Orthodox Trots, like the Spartacus Bund and Ted Grant's tendency, the international Marxist tendency, which I think now is the Revolutionary Communist Party, Part 85. I don't know how many RCPs there's been, but there's been a bunch. And I think it's the Revolutionary Communist Organization now instead of the IMT. But nonetheless, it's that tendency. They tended to be Soviet defensists. And then you had Sam Marcy, who was a Trotskyist tanky who defended Mao. And I say he's a tanky in the technical sense. He defended the Soviets' actions in both the Hungarian uprising and the Prague Spring. So not in the, oh, he's a Stalinist, or the way that sometimes social democrats will call anyone to the left of them that kind of doesn't, who is an anarchist, a tanky. I mean, specifically, he thought the tanks should be rolling through the streets of Budapest and Prague. So he was the founder of the WWP, and that is where the Party for Socialism and Liberation split from in 2003 or 2004. I can't remember the exact year. But arguably, two of the largest Marxist-Leninist organizations in the United States outside of the CPUSA come from a Trotskyist tendency, which is pretty funny to me. But I bring this up because if you look at Eastman, Burnham, and Chambers, you have a pretty wide representation of the various tendencies on the formal American left in the 1920s. So if you go to Europe, things get even wilder. I mean, there's people like Werner Sombart. Werner Sombart was a Nazi, but he started off as a Marxist. In fact, his most famous piece in English is Why America Isn't Socialist, which was circulated in the 1970s to try to explain why the New Left failed. But he got obsessed with productive labor. He got obsessed with making alliances with the entrepreneurial petite bourgeoisie. And then he got obsessed with the Jews being the source of capitalism, and we know where that went. And then famously, Mussolini himself was part of the maximalist faction, the Italian Socialist Party. And then you had people like Tasca, who was maybe a fascist sympathizer, maybe a triple agent for the Popular Front, but anti-Stalinist at any rate. So we'd already seen this tendency in Italy and in Germany too, but we can get into the specifics of the big three for America. Eastman is really crucial in helping set up what becomes a National Review. James Whittaker Chambers is the person who's, is used to launch the House of Un-American Activities. Like, he's one of the key members, with people like Will Herberg, who was also a former Marxist-Leninist, who became an anti-communist. And then Burnham is Burnham and Shachtman end up being super influential in some ways to the entire American political spectrum that's not communist. And that's really fascinating to me. Shachtman's children, there is a truth to this, did by and large, after the dissolution of the SPA, which Shachtman helped dissolve, went in two directions. They either followed one of Shachtman's proteges, Michael Harrington, who you may know of,
DSA.
Yeah, one of the founders of the DSA. And then, or they went off with people around Commentary Magazine, and that's Norman Poderhertz, Bill and Irving Kristol, a lot of people who were from that milieu, although they're often cited as Trotskyists. Most of them actually weren't. They are cited as Trotskyists because they had a relationship to the Socialist Youth, the Youth Socialist League, which had Trotskyist in it, or they had relationships directly with Max Shachtman, but they themselves were mostly kind of left social democrats for the most part. Very few of them were ever explicitly Trotskyist or in any explicit Trotskyist organization, but there is a line of lineage there.
What about Lyndon LaRouche? Because he's often brought up a lot today, because people sometimes use the term LaRoucheite to describe people of the notorious ACP, the American Communist Party, founded by a bunch of figures like Jackson Hinkle and Haz al-Din, who were sometimes described as Maga communists. They're often described as LaRoucheites by other people, but they deny that. I'm curious how does LaRouche play into this? Because from what I learned about him, he seems very different from these figures, but he definitely seems like a left person who turned into a right-winger.
Yeah, so he's different than the figures that we're talking about priorly in that he never totally breaks with socialism. He does become an anti-Marxist, but he still sees himself as some kind of socialist through his entire development.
And he worked with Reagan, I thought.
He did.
Worked with the Reagan administration, and he thought Reagan was the lesser evil.
Yeah, he did. He worked with the Reagan administration to help with Star Wars. He is a fascinating character, interestingly, from New Hampshire, and he got involved with politics because he was a conscientious objector to World War II, which is because as a Quaker, he ended up becoming a Marxist in college, and he was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, the main line of American Trotskyism until the 1980s, really. And around the 60s, he founded this thing called the National Caucus of Labor Committees. And he started teaching his own version of dialectical materialism at the Free School in New York. And there was already signs that he was kind of going in a strange direction, but the National Caucus of Labor Committees was trying to take over the role of the AFL-CIO and actually then lead the unions in a direct revolt against the American government. He gets implicated by establishing some kind of intelligence spy network in 1971. And this seems to push him more and more into the right wing. According to his autobiography, he was hanging out with Mark Rudd, and then Mark Rudd's faction began assaulting LaRouche's faction on Columbia University. And this led LaRouche to start identifying lefts as proto-fascist. He would call them left proto-fascist. And he started having his members assault with like bats, chains, nunchucks, whatever they had around on campuses. Communist Party of America, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Progressive Labor Party, as well as the Panthers and the Black Power movement. There's at least 60 reported assaults. And he started also getting into his weird British Jewish conspiracies, where this increasingly becomes a key focus. And around 1977, his party, which only had 1,000 members, but had like 37 offices, started pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And they also somehow got involved with maybe training like paramilitary forces for the CIA. Like, it's very vague. Part of the problem with LaRouche from this time period is we don't know when he's telling the truth. We don't know how much of this actually really happened. We know the assaults happened. We know we had some relationship to the Reagan administration, but we don't know much beyond that. He was accused of brainwashing his members. We do know as early as 1974 that he established contacts with the Liberty Lobby and the Klan, so the Third Ku Klux Klan. And he also started, denouncing Marx as a Jew, but trying to save socialism from Marxism around this time. There were informants in him, so like Roy Frankenhauser, who also had ties to the Klan and the American Nazi Party. And he alleged that, there was issues with him, and LaRouche accused him of being a federal agent, which he probably was. And this gets very strange. LaRouche's LaRouche also had a computer technologies corporation that worked for people like Mobil Oil and Citibank and the Ford Foundation. So, I mean, he had access to a whole lot of uh, all kinds of bizarro stuff. And he starts pushing, he starts turning on globalists. He gets worried about internationalists, and he writes his own version of socialist economics called dialectical economics, which he calls an introduction to political philosophy. It's wild.
Let me guess. Does he think that finance capital is the only problem and that the other productive capital is fine?
Yeah, and that's a secret conspiracy by the British Crown, who may also be the Jews. Yes.
Classic.
Like, yeah, there's so it's interesting. I mean, the thing about when people call MAGA communist LaRoucheites is people, Haz al-Din has spoken at Schiller Institute events. And when LaRouche died, his legacy split into the LaRouche PAC and to the Schiller Institute. And the Schiller Institute has a lot of ties with private corporations in China. So it's a kind of weird setup.
Interesting.
LaRouche PAC was involved with Stop the Steal, for example, for Trump in 2020 and 2021. So it's wild how he ended up. Another thing that you see in people like LaRouche, and I think this I wouldn't call LaRouche a fascist, by the way, but I would say he was fascistic in the sense that there is this attempt to claim that he was moving through like a socialism that was beyond left and right, but that the left was really, tools of the international globalist order and the right was merely mistaken. And you do see that rhetoric out of Haz al-Din. Like he says that explicitly in The Rise of MAGA Communism, his kind of shot across the bow blog post in 2022.
What's interesting though about what at least Haz says, from what I've seen, is he still identifies as a leftist. He doesn't reject the left-right distinction, but he thinks that there's like what is the left today he calls a pan-left. And the pan-left is like, yes, tools of the international bourgeoisie, and the right is the national bourgeoisie. And that's sort of his framing, but he still kind of does invoke like a left historical legacy. Whereas,
except in his key documents, he only cites German revolutionary conservatives. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going off what he says, because I saw his interview with Doug Lane, where he kind of expresses his beliefs, and I found that interesting. It's really strange because someone like Jackson Hinkle, I think, doesn't really associate himself as a leftist at all. And like these two figures are very close, and I can see why people draw parallels between them and LaRouche, like in a lot of ways. But I think a key distinction is that, well, there's that left aspect, but more the major difference is that LaRouche is almost like a MAGA communist or a MAGA socialist that was actually MAGA, in the sense that he really was America first, to the extent where he pretty much just supported American imperialism. Whereas
no, you can't accuse Haz
the most credit I would give the MAGA comms is that they kind of are anti-imperialist in the sense that they are against American imperialism, but what that often boils down to is just being pro-Russian imperialism and very pro-China. Whether you want to say China's imperialist is a more complicated debate, but they're like very pro-China and Russia, whereas LaRouche is almost like this, like he just is a Republican. And I can see a parallel between him and James Burnham, because prior to this podcast, I was listening to James Burnham's book, The Suicide of the West, which is one of his last books, if not, I think
it's his last book. Yeah.
Might have been his last book, yeah, because James Burnham has an interesting trajectory. As you mentioned, he starts off as a Trotskyist, then he writes The Managerial Revolution, where he's trying to have like this Marxist critique, but critiquing Marxist class theory about how class is occurring. And then he writes The Machiavellians, which I think is a very interesting book if you just want to understand the thought of like, the so-called realist school, the Machiavellian school, like Pareto and them. And by that point, like James Burnham seems to just reject Marxism in that book. Like he pretty much rejects socialism. And in Suicide of the West, I was listening to some of it today, and it's, I mean, to me, it seems like you're listening to Douglas Murray or just like a actual neocon. It's like listening to Dick Cheney, but except it was written in the 80s.
Yeah, James Burnham is a fascinating figure, and I can go into his detail in in a little bit more detail. He's part of the American Trotskyist movement, but he comes in actually not through the Trotskyists expelled from the Communist Party. He comes in with the Trotskyists expelled from the Socialist Party for being too left wing, and then that leads the Trotskyists expelled from the Socialist Party and the Trotskyists expelled from the Communist Party, joined together and eventually formed the Socialist Workers' Party. But already by like 1937, Burnham sides with Max Shachtman in moving the critique of the Soviet Union from this critique of the deformed worker state, a worker state that's stalled, but is still worth defending. It's still a worker state, to the position that it is bureaucratic collectivism. And then later on to the position that adopted from left communists and anarchists, that the Soviet Union was state capitalism. And Shachtman and Burnham split pretty hard after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which caused a lot of people to leave, both the SWP and the CPUSA. The CPSA wouldn't regain its numbers again until the Popular Front.
For listeners who don't know what that means, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was when the Soviet Union made a temporary alliance with Nazi Germany after the British and French refused to engage in a alliance with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany and allowed them to invade Czechoslovakia, which then the Soviets pulled that surprise alliance. And a lot of leftists didn't like it, as you were mentioning.
Yeah. But by 1940, he wrote a kind of famous letter to Trotsky himself that was published where he denounces dialectical materialism entirely. So he doesn't say he's not a Marxist yet, but he goes, dialectical materialism, from Deitzgen forward is one of the key, philosophical doctrines of Marxism. I would say most Marxists, that's one of the things they agree on. Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists definitely agree on it. He breaks with Shachtman over that as well, although Shachtman publishes it. And when he writes The Managerial Revolution, what he says he's doing is using the methodologies he got from Trotskyism, but specifically from Shachtman's form of Trotskyism, bureaucratic collectivism, expanding that out. And instead of doing it dialectically, because he thinks that's nonsense, he's trying to do it analytically and saying, like, look, capitalism has changed, that Marx and Engels were even in some ways predicted it about the joint stockholders socializing labor, that we are now in the dominance of managers. Now, by managers, he did not mean college-educated people necessarily, and I think people often misread that. He thought, and this is clear in the New Machiavellians or the Machiavellians, if you read the original book, that the best managers would come out of the military-industrial complex. So that's where we should be looking for it. But what you see is this fascination. You mentioned that the New Machiavellians is about the realist school. It's about the realist school and the elite school and the early Italian fascists up to who Mussolini liked. Some of them even joined the party, but Burnham doesn't put that in the book. So you can already see where he's headed.
It's about Mikkels, who's like a social democrat, I believe, and then Pareto, who becomes a fascist early on. Mosca, who I'm not sure if he became a fascist, but he's part of the elite school. And George Sorel, who's like this, people know Sorel and the Sorelian myth. Sorel's like this weird kind of nationalistic anarchist.
Yeah, nationalistic Marxian anarchist who also was a rabid anti-Semite, but didn't believe the anti-Semitism. He was actually stoking anti-Semitism because he thought it was easier to get people to fight fascism if they thought they were fighting Jews. It was really cynical. He praised both Lenin, and one of his last acts is praising Mussolini, but he was never formally a fascist. but almost everybody sees him as a step in that direction, particularly since so many of the national syndicalists around him ended up in the fascist orbit. And yeah, Albert Michel, it's my Ben Mickles. I think he does actually end up in the fascist party before he dies. So it's a very weird constellation of people. Burnham basically thinks that the competition between fascism, socialism, and capitalism is just a competition between different types of managers from different classes, but that the managers really dominate. Burnham's also interesting because other people that we kind of see as right-wing deviationists or maybe even former leftists, the person I'm about to mention now is definitely in a gray area, George Orwell. George Orwell spends a whole lot of the 30s like responding to Burnham negatively and critiquing Burnham's books. But then, if you read 1984, the theory of revolution that's coming out of Goldstein's mouth is Max Shachtman and James Burnham. It's not Trotsky, even though, it's presented as Trotskyism, but the idea that there's a center strata that's always actually the revolutionary core and all that stuff that comes out of Goldstein and everything's just competition between managers, that's Burnham, almost verbatim. So Burnham then is still kind of fascinating, interesting, because, when I would hear about how bad, when I was a paleo-conservative, and I mentioned this to you, there was constant talk about the Trotskyists, they all become neoconservatives. In fact, that's the first place I heard it. I didn't hear it on the left first. I heard it on the right. And what they meant, and what they usually meant by Trotskyists, to be quite frank, was Jew.
Yeah, I heard Alex Jones and Jackson Hinkle talking about the Trotskyist Neocon pipeline, and they were definitely flirting with that kind of signifier. Like, they were like, the globalists, the Trotskyists run the world.
Right.
The Trotskyists run the world. And it's like, I don't know, man. Who's a Trotskyist who's running the world?
They had a little.
They probably mean Jews.
Yeah, they mean Jews.
Seemed like,
it was a little bit more true when you talk about like the people around Commentary magazine who became the core of the neoconservatives, like
like the Bush
of the Bush administration. And that was when I really heard it. But even then, as I said, not all those guys were actually Trotskyists. Like David Horowitz flirted with Trotskyism, but he was also temporarily a Maoist. And then he also was an ally to the Black Panthers and a personal friend of Huey Newton until he believed that Huey Newton had one of his friends shot. It was a weird coalition of ex-leftists. And I would often hear, for example, that Max Shachtman was like the first neocon when I was on the right. And then I actually looked it up. He was a Skip Jackson Democrat, which is still pretty bad. I mean, it's pretty right-wing. For those of you who don't know, Skip Jackson was like the anti-communist Democrats who are like fans of the Truman through Johnson administration of like, well, we're going to do concessions to the workers and we're going to have a progressive social policy, but we're also going to try to destroy the USSR as best we can in absolute unvarnished terms. And that's really where Shachtman kind of ended up, particularly after the Socialist Party of America was dissolved. But a lot of Shachtman's ideological children did end up in the Nixon and Reagan and Bush White Houses. But I remember them, when you hear Candace Owens say Stalin was really a Jew, I heard shit like that when I was on the paleo-conservative right. It's part of what pushed me out. I would hear them talk about how all Jews need to apologize to all Christian society for Marxism. That was another thing that came around with that kind of talk. Joe Sobran wrote a whole article about it. If you don't know who Joe Sobran was, he was a National Review writer who was so Pat Buchananite that they kicked him out for his racial views of the National Review. So, saying the Cryet part's too loud, basically, is what he got in trouble for. But that didn't happen probably till the late 90s. And so I ran into these memes there first. And when I actually looked into the situation, it is true for a bunch of people around Shachtman who were also always Zionists, even when they were on the left. And a lot of them did become neoconservatives. That is a true pattern. And LaRouche is another example. But if you look at the broader array of who moves right, there's the negationists coming out of the French ultra left. A lot of them actually end up as ultra nationalists for regionalist secession movements in France and basically fascists. They get into Holocaust denial, etc. Famously, Dominique Blanc, who was the anonymous writer of Militancy, the Highest Phase of Alienation, he ends up eventually moving to the far, far right in France. There was a lot of former Maoists, and I do mean a lot of former Maoists, who become like Sarkozy party lower ups, and some are even involved with Le Pen in France. Some of them go through a period of post-Marxism first, but a lot of them don't. So I think to me, that's interesting, but Burnham's fascinating because he's so important to so many different areas where we see this. He really helps build up movement conservatism. He is, in a lot of key ways, one of the key players in the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. He is a key figure in the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is where a whole lot of former Marxists used to get, and sometimes still Marxist, anti-Soviet Marxist, some people who didn't say they were anti-Soviet Marxists, like Marcuse, they were tied into the Congress for Cultural Freedom too. The Frankfurt School wrote papers for them by and large. Not all of them. Grossman went back to the DDR. Some other people like broke with them, but the late Frankfurt School, of the generation that we think about, a lot of them ended up writing with the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And
Yeah, I should
Mhm.
add something to that though. So Marcuse worked for the OSS during World War II. That's known. As far as I'm aware of, he hasn't written for magazines funded by the Congress of Cultural Freedom. That was Adorno and Horkheimer.
right.
And from all what I've seen, they weren't even really aware of this. Like, that they were writing for magazines funded by that.
I was about to get to that. This is a problem with throwing that at people, is a Congress for Cultural Freedom was a front, and a lot of people did not know that it was involved in many left-wing publications. So, but Burnham was crucial to setting that up. And it wasn't exposed until 1966 that the CIA had set up the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And it was a shock to a lot of people who wrote for it. So I don't want to make it like these were not people who knew they were working for the CIA. I know that there are people who think that there were. I've been recently listening to a scholar named Mueller that I heard Gabriel Rockhill talking to, and I have issues with Gabriel Rockhill's work, but it's neither here nor there. I think it's a little bit too simple. But it says that Marcuse may have been more involved in anti-communist activities than we know, but his external output doesn't reflect that at all. And he was a pretty big defender of Mao in some ways, at least in the 60s. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, his last book, Counter Revolution and Revolt, is about a lot of those anti-communist efforts that a lot of the left in America at the time wasn't that aware of, like Operation Condor and like all the attempts to slaughter Latin American communist movements and what happened in Indonesia at the time. He writes about all of that in his last book, Counter Revolution and Revolt. And he actually applies was it Grossman or one of those thinkers actually critiqued Marcuse's one-dimensional man for like overstating how stable state capitalism would be.
Oh yeah. I think it was, maybe it wasn't Grossman, but I think it was, maybe it was, because Grossman gets booted in the kind of the economist of the Frankfurt School after Grossman is basically, after Grossman was basically, Friedrich Pollock. Go ahead.
Yeah, so he actually ends up accepting that critique in Counter Revolution and Revolt. Like, he basically says that, and he actually relates that to the counter revolution, so to speak, like the premeditative counter revolution. He thinks that, like, because the system is starting to decay, it's starting to use it's starting to veer away from soft power more towards classic hard power. And it's also trying to, like, expand venues of profit abroad by, like, making sure that no countries go red and ensuring that countries can be open to marketization, et cetera, et cetera. There's a little detail like a lot of people miss when they critique Marcuse sometimes, I notice, because like counter-revolution and revolt is like, I think, a great way to understand where his thought goes, which is one of his later books.
Yeah, well, I think the idea that the Frankfurt School was like a conspiracy. This is another thing I remember learning on the paleoconservative right, was that the Frankfurt School is the beginnings of cultural Marxism, because the proletariat then revolt the way they said. It's the Frankfurt School and Gramsci, which is interesting because Gramsci and the Frankfurt School really don't share that many assumptions, but nonetheless, and that it moved to culture war to undermine Western civilization. And again, all this is pretty coded because what they start focusing on is Horkheimer's Jewish, Adorno's half Jewish, so they consider him Jewish, even though from halakhic standpoint, he's Jewish on the wrong side. Marcuse's Jewish. So they start focusing in on, oh, well, this is this, Freudian Jewish plot combined with Marxism to undermine Western culture. And that's the first place that I saw that. And I was kind of surprised when I started seeing that rhetoric on the far left. Now, I don't want to exonerate the Frankfurt School for everything. I mean, Horkheimer ends up endorsing the Vietnam War. Adorno is weirdly quiet about it one way or the other. I'll see where Habermas has actually ended up going. He's kind of like the crown prince philosopher of the EU. So that's really hard to get behind. But it's just not clear to me that.
Did you mean to say Habermas?
Yeah, Habermas.
Oh, yeah, Habermas. Habermas is weird because he's like after all of them, right? He's like a student.
Yeah, he's a student. He's part
he's
of the third generation of the Frankfurt School.
He basically is just embed Marxism, like fully.
Yeah, for like liberatory discourse theory, and whereas Raymond Geist or Geist, I'm not quite sure, it's Hungarian. He doubles down on the Marxist parts, and he's also a kind of a third generation Frankfurt School descendant, and so that gets tied up. There's also what happens around the Italian American communists, Eugene Genovese and Paul Piccone. Seems to have a crisis in the late 70s, early 80s around both getting criticized for his book on slavery and then the collapse of Italian Eurocommunism. And he goes pretty hard right wing. He's like, a big defender of the Southern agrarians. He becomes a Republican. He defends the Bush administration. And then you have Paul Piccone, who was the editor of Cileos magazine, also an Italian American, also from that kind of Euro-communist Italian tradition. And Piccone moves Cileos from being the Frankfurt School journal that's very explicitly kind of Marxist to being less and less tied to the left at all. And by the 1990s, Marcuse's student, Paul Gottfried, who is a pretty far right-winger, ends up working with them, and they start publishing like the European New Right in America and stuff like that. And
I'm kind of curious.
so Paul Gottfried was a professor of Richard Spencer. He is a key figure in the paleoconservative movement. He's a Jewish man, and that's kind of important because he's harder to hit for being an anti-Semite, and he is not pro-Hitler. But he was a big fan of Pat Buchanan. He wrote a book called The Strange Non-Death of Liberalism, which is about what he talks about as the managerial elites. So he's in this Burnham school of thinking, the paleoconservative branch of it. And he was known for defending a lot of alt-rightists. Actually, he was a little while, he worked for Talking Mag and the American Conservative magazine. But he also was Marcuse's student. And he's one of the people who would talk about cultural Marxism, but then he'd talk about how people were misrepresenting the Frankfurt School. So if you're like a liberal or a leftist and you encounter him, he doesn't seem as reactionary when you listen to him as he is, but he was big on importing translations of Greca, that is Alain de Benoit's French far right group. And he was big on, he wrote a book kind of talking about, Hitlerism's bad, but maybe fascism isn't all that bad. And, anti-fascism is just a watchword for bad stuff. That he has a whole book basically around that. But in the 90s, he worked with Paul Picone for a little while at Chilios magazine and had a lot of this European far new right stuff translated in English and published in ostensibly what was a leftist journal. So Chilios, after Paul Picone died, actually is sort of, it just doesn't really have an, I think it still exists. I'm not sure if it does, but I think it does. And it doesn't really have an ideological orientation at all anymore. So it's interesting where that all went.
It's interesting because I did interview a left-wing student of Marcuse, Andrew Feenberg. I had him on my show like a couple of months ago. And I wonder if he knows Paul Gottfried. I want to kind of see if they ever interacted. But aside from that, I do want to dial something a little bit, which is, you have all these different cases of people shifting from left to right. I'm kind of curious to what extent that is a personal psychological phenomenon, or to which there are contradictions within the left itself that push people right. And to what extent it's a mix of that. Because, like, to what extent is, people going rightward just a result of disenchantment, like a left movement not going anywhere, and they might associate their past with those political endeavors, and they kind of want to erase that. And part of a psychological coping mechanism could be, shifting rightwards, becoming the opposite. Because it's a very different phenomenon from shifting like moderately center or becoming just a kind of reformist liberal or something, right? It's a very different visceral reaction.
I think it's a bit of both. So what we see in a lot of these cases, and I used to refer to this as a Whittaker Chambers problem, is there some kind of traumatic event that usually is partially real. All right. For Whittaker Chambers, a bunch of people that he knew and the American Communist Party disappeared on a trip to the Comintern. And then it seems like some of the communists tried to out that he was secretly a homosexual. And so he freaks out, and liberals, and it's not just leftists. I mean, liberals don't respond well to it. And they get into these positive reinforcement groups with pernicious forces on the right. I can think of a lot of cases where this happened. Arthur Koestler, this kind of happened with. Leszek Kolakowski, this kind of happened with. So you have criticisms that may be based on something real. David Horowitz, who I mentioned earlier, still alive, still raving about how all liberals are secretly Marxist, whatever. For him, it was the death of someone he helped get a job as a bookkeeper for the Black Panther Party who was murdered. David Horowitz really does seem to truly believe that it was a hit put out on this person by Huey Newton. Supposedly that's been admitted to by someone, by Huey Newton, but we can't really trust the sources that say it. And the response to that was so visceral that he, flips. I think for a lot of people in the 20s and 30s, it's responses to like these large sectarian groups responding to massive scales in geopolitics that they don't see coming. Like for a whole lot of people, it was how wildly the USSR seemed to pivot in World War II, and that wasn't explained very well by the communist parties in the United States. They were very shady about it, and so they just looked radically inconsistent, and it was assumed that they had something to hide. And that pushed a lot of people to the right too. So I don't think we can totally drop the individual psychology part of it, but I do think there is a tendency on the left to just totally discount when we hear bad things about people on the left, unless we accuse them of it, right? Because we're also good at being a circular fire squad, but it's very much a circular firing squad that plays by certain rules. And if you start pointing out that there's deviations in these rules, you didn't get a lot of pushback. Now, I still see most of these people as having a weak and reactive character. A lot of them, for example, I'll take an example that I was reading about today that prepped for the show, was Ronald Radosh. Ronald Radosh, former Marxist-Leninist, supposedly went to Cuba and heard someone talk about, he witnessed people practicing what was advanced psychological science at the time, but probably very ill-advised, which was a lot of lobotomy. And then he heard some member of the party say, well, socialist lobotomies are different than capitalist lobotomies, and it broke something in him. And then he goes on this wild goose chase.
Do you mean literally lobotomy? Like a
Literal
lobotomy?
lobotomy.
Oh my God. I use that as a joke sometimes. Like I say, I'm lobotomized. So I couldn't tell if you were joking.
No, I mean a literal lobotomy. And supposedly that leads him to become an anti-leftist. But what's interesting is these people never stop, like, at the event or say, oh, well, there's just problems and, this element of thought. It tends to flip on its head. And one thing that I will say, a lot of these people are often in not just the Trotskyist left opposition or, the Shachtman, which was arguably to the left of that. You see it when people take a lot of very ultra left positions very quickly. They often flip entirely. Like you just see a complete jump. And I think that's because a lot of those responses are emotional responses in the first place. And so when they encounter something that disrupts their delusion or disenchants them, or the left doesn't do anything, and my God, do we have centuries of that happening? Or something's ugly. I mean, in the 60s, the big event is the Cambodian-Vietnam War that really breaks a lot of people, and the Sino-Soviet split. Like that breaks a lot of people's brain. And so a lot of those people just can't handle it. They flip, but then they start I'm going to find, I think they're secretly communist in the closet. They're the kind of people who were accused, they'll get into stuff like the Birchers and be like, I don't know, maybe Eisenhower was a communist or something. Like you see this actually quite a lot.
Yeah, the John Birch Society. Learning about that was fascinating. Because it's like, they are fucking extreme.
They are.
And they thought they did Eisenhower was a communist.
They're extreme, and they are highly influential on movement conservatism after Goldwater. So, and what is even funnier about them is for all their paranoia about Marxist-Leninists, they deliberately set up their organization along what they thought Marxist-Leninists would do as a counter anti-propaganda cell. Like they went all the way. And that's another interesting thing about these leftists turned rightists. I was actually taught by one. I had a professor of Hegel who was a left-winger and went to Sorbonne. Something personally happened to him. He became a Christian and he got really into Ronald Reagan. He's one of those kind of conservatives, right? And he was a critic of the Bush administration's war policy, but more or less that's where he was. He was a pretty good Hegel scholar, actually, but he would sit me down sometimes and tell me stuff like, we use Solinsky. Like, we use Solinsky better than the leftists ever did. Or he would say stuff like, we learned how to fight Leninism by doing Leninism better than the Leninists. And that was their mentality. So what's interesting about a lot of these people is they actually engage in the kind of conspiracies that they accuse other people of doing, because I think a lot of them really do believe it's happening. And they think the only way you can fight it is to beat fire with fire. You even see this in James Burnham. Like James Burnham's a new Machiavellians. It's like, well, you can't defeat the managers, so pick the better one. And they're going to come out of the military. Like that's just what realism means. We're going to, it's all about power. We pick the managers. We know what the managers are. We got to pick the competent ones who might kind of care about freedom. There's this weird sort of communism is the most dangerous thing ever, but also we have to do what the communists do to fight them mentality out of a lot of these people. And so that does indicate to me that there's something very reactive in their personality to begin with. But I don't want to exonerate the left or just say it's just personal. I think left-wing culture doesn't help with this. Like, for example, it's very hard to reestablish yourself in left-wing culture after a scandal. I think we all know it. And that's not a cancellation problem. You can read it historically. You can see it all the way back to like the 1870s. And what causes a scandal isn't always predictable. So, those two traits together lead to a very volatile situation, I think.
And I do see a certain tendency, like, how rightists sometimes get so paranoid about people being secret communists. I do see that within certain leftists, particularly leftists who used to be seduced at one point in time by that very same right wing thought, where they see little glimpses or just what they think are small signs of reactionary thought. And they go all in. This person's a fascist. This person is that.
I'll be honest, I
And
fight
it's
that in myself. Like, because there's certain things that I smell and I'm just like, smells like nationalism. You're 3 steps away. But I also know that about myself. I know that my own psychology would lead me to over conclude about that. So I have a very hard rule that I've actively imposed on myself that, like, you don't judge these people by tendencies. And we were mentioning the way in which I think MAGA communism is like LaRouche, but I want to say one key way in which it is not at all. There is no central authority figure. I mean, Hinkle kinda, but not really. That really is a gaggle of weird ideologies put together. And yes, a lot of them have like internal cargo cults, but like Midwestern Marx and Haz al-Din and Jackson Hinkle and those people have different ideologies.
they're very different.
Right.
Like, and I think they have different motivations too, because to me, I see out of all of them, I think they're all true believers except Hinkle.
Mhm.
Like, to me, Hinkle, I just smell opportunist. Like, I've met people like him, and they're always usually part of the Conservative Party of Canada. Like, what I mean, there's a certain demeanor,
Mhm.
a certain character, a certain smirk. I don't know. I just smell it. To me, like, Jackson Hinkle is someone who, like, is looking for Russia bucks. I don't know that for sure, but it just seems like that. Like, based on the way he conducts himself politically, it's always about getting approval from these big leaders. For him, I think like his dream would be to meet Xi Jinping. Maybe he already has. I don't know.
Mhm.
But Haas to me is like a true believer. Like, he's just so serious in how he says things. He comes off at like a parody at times, but it's, he seems serious. And I think like Haas's weird politics to me, I recently learned that he actually comes from a
Yeah.
Shia Lebanese background. I find that interesting because, I kind of see like perhaps his politics is a weird way to reconcile his own contradictory upbringing. Like, he has a religious upbringing. He talked about that. Like, he is from a religious household. He also used to be a Heideggerian.
Used to
And he
use a strong word, but yeah, he definitely had more. I mean, he seems to have, I'm going to say this because I'm not sure what Haz's true identity is, although I have my suspicions, but I'm not going to accuse anyone without knowing. He seems to have come from a background in the Riza Negastani's part of the
CRU.
GCRU, yeah. And I see it in his writing. I also see both Stalin, but oddly also Bordigist phrases in his writing. And I, like you, think he means what he says. I think some of the readings are wild and kind of crazy to me, and I also think he's influenced by a whole lot of not left-wing at all thinkers. I do think he's sincere. Now, I don't know if that makes me like him more, but I don't think he's just an op. And a lot of people think a lot of these people who turn right-wing are just corrupt. And I can tell you, I've known a lot of them. I can tell you stories about, personal people I knew who went right wing, particularly after the Vampire Castle and Mark Fisher scandals.
We'll save that for the
Yeah,
back room.
we can talk about it in the back room because I have personal experience with this. And the thing is, yes, sometimes they made more money, but almost all of them really believed what they said. Hinkle, he feels like he was created in a lab. Like, and I
Yeah.
don't feel like, I feel like Haz is too weird.
He's too autistic.
Yeah.
Like, that's the vibe I get. Like, I mean, I don't mean that literally, but like, he just seemed like someone who was very obsessed with niche things when he was young. And he's trying to wrestle with these interests along with his own personal upbringing. He's trying to create something that bundles all this together. And the problem with being a quote unquote influencer is you're expected to be consistent when people are really like bundles of contradictory ideas. And when you're expected to be consistent, especially if you get fame very fast, especially at a young age, right? You're expected to be like a thing, and you can prematurely concoct a weird mix of ideologies that has no coherence whatsoever. And I think like Haas is in this weird position where he's like a leader of a movement. Like he does conduct himself like a bit of a cult leader. So I think he's like pressured to like keep this facade that he knows what he's doing, that he has an ideology. And then people who overanalyze this stuff, I think, look at him like or like as if he has like this secret Mussolini agenda. When I think it's just he's just kind of seduced in all these directions by contradictory ideas. And that's another point of mine I wanted to bring up actually is I think people get more easily seduced by right-wing ideas when they only were immersed in the left and never really were immersed in the right when they were younger.
Absolutely.
Like, or at least they weren't around a lot of right-wingers or right-wing ideas. Because when you hear right-wing ideas for the first time and not just like the leftist stereotype of them, they can seem a lot more sophisticated in contrast to the straw man in which they're usually presented. So like for the first time, if you read the Bible, simply like, right, it's very fucking profound. You know, like there's a difference between rejecting Christianity because it's not cool and rejecting it, you know, on a different ground. But like, you know, you come and discover this stuff. I can totally see why people are like seduced by it. You know?
Well, I would go pretty far in that direction. Like I've read a lot of the text, you know, even a lot of the far right text. I have my black collection of text. Like I own, not that I paid for it, but I own a lot of Arcos Press to know what they think. If you don't know what that is, that's the people who publish Dugin and the European New Right and a lot of race realists and the alt-right. They're all, by and large, and current radical traditionalism, which is a precursor movement. Those come out of like two presses for the most part. And I've read a lot of that stuff too. And some of it can feel very intellectually enriching. I worry. I mean, I talk about this a lot. And Know Your Enemy, for example, does this a little bit. But like when people are just making fun of Ben Shapiro, and I'm like, you know that he wants you to do that, right? This is a mutually constitutive feedback loop. And he's saying stupid shit to bait you into spreading this meme, and you're doing it. But also, when someone goes and read, I don't know, Russell Kirk or Evola, I'll pick two opposite ends of reactionary conservative thought, and all you've been hearing is Crowder and Shapiro, that shit does seem profound. And it's not as stupid as it's presented. As actually, I do a show on right-wing thought, Boundless and Bottomless Seas, where I insist that we actually go through step by step and talk about what these people are arguing, because I get tired of the, you know, X is Y, and I'm very careful with words. So for example, you know, I will call something fascistic or post-fascist, but I often won't call it fascist because I don't think it is. And yet that word gets thrown around so much that it's just like, okay, by fascist, you honestly just mean bad or maybe authoritarian, whatever that means even. I don't know really what you mean when you say fascist. And this is actually something I see. This is not unique to leftists. This is across the ideological spectrum. These words are used in ways that category inflate them into meaningless. I'll give you another example. Wokeness is a word that I felt like I knew what it was. Now I don't really know what people mean by it. It's like and its history is as a term is always moving, but it's been inflated to mean so many different things that now I really don't know. Whereas I do think I had a vague idea of what people meant from it in 2019, and I really did know what people meant from it in 2015, or when it was used in the 60s and 70s, what was meant by it, which is actually very different. And so I find that inflationary character makes it hard to understand people. And I think leftists, they understand the bullshit when rightists do it, when, you know, they call Kamala Harris a communist. And I'm always like, oh my God, I wish. And like, I really do. Sometimes I listen to what rightists say about us and I'm like, I really wish I thought we were this competent. Like, it would be so great if we were.
Fascinating, because I do think you can gain a weird insight into strategy and how the right wing imagines the left to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like the right wing imagines the left to be way more pragmatic and calculated and having strong foresight than it actually is. Like they always imagine that their left is infiltrating these institutions in which they are presenting themselves as liberals, but they are really Leninists in liberal clothing. When, in reality, if you even try to moderate your rhetoric to be a little more appealing to the average soccer mom or average Joe, you're called out for being a revisionist.
Yeah.
Or
a
being
Strasserite or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's another thing with that, like I think on the left, and this is perhaps a problem on the right too, but I do think this is actually more on the left because the left is the side that presents itself more as like a pioneer of justice. Although, the right has elements of that too, but I still think like right wing is still defined way more in reaction to left. And that it exists on left too, but still left is based on this kind of like moral justice idea. Even that's even true, I think, of many Marxists who like would think themselves as cold, analytical, materialists. They're driven by just like moral justice. I think politics, for most people, it's moral, And because of that, it is seen as morally wrong to even like to not just be a true, authentic radical. When reaching people requires people to code shift, that's just literal evolution. Like if you want to, persuade people, you have to meet them where they are. And I think there's a real strong aversion to that on the left, like an aversion to any kind of moderation. They think that moderation of rhetoric necessarily means moderation of principles.
Right.
When that doesn't have to be the case. That is often the case, unfortunately, but it doesn't have to be the case. You can present yourself, you can actually be a Leninist in liberal clothing. There's really not much benefit one would get from being a liberal in Leninist clothing, unless you're paid by the CIA or something.
Right.
Or
maybe you're like trying to get a business contract in China. I don't know, but that's like the only times I can see it being useful. But yeah, I think a lot about this. I mean, weirdly, I give Midwestern Marx a hard time. I've like kind of gone through Carlos Garrido's book once, like word by word. But there actually is a point that I think that they're onto. I don't think it's like in the way that they state it, like this weird metaphysical conceit that Western leftists have going all the way to Plato. But I do think there's a sense in which like the form is taken for the substance so much on the left. So if you, and this manifests in multiple ways. Like we also tend to think that if we change the form of a social problem by changing the language around it, that will inherently change its substance. And I just think that's kind of nonsense. That no, if the social problem's still there, all you're doing is making the new phraseology silly later on, or it will become a slur eventually. But there's also just hesitant to meet people where they are. You see this in a lot of ways. Like, for example, out of respect to my trans friends, I use the term Latin as opposed to Latinx. Or Latina and Latino. And the reason why I do is because there's a fucking normal word in English that people don't feel called out by when, are put regular, Latin people on my street in a weird corner because they don't know, like literally, I've never heard anyone, not to say that there's no one in Latin America who uses Latinx, but it is very rare. In my neighborhood, which is mostly Spanish speaking, mostly from Central America, if you were to approach people with that, they would find you funny. But if I say Latin, they're fine. No one's thrown off about it. And I've thought a lot about that, where there's these like wars over words. And sometimes I'm like, well, I get the point of not wanting to throw X group under the bus by using a problematic word. I'm with you on that. But why are you using this weird word that you don't have to, that calls attention to itself, that's a cultural demarcator? And Latinx or Latinx or however, there's not even a joint like conception of how you say it. That's one of those words. It strikes people as elite. And so I say Latin. And I've gotten crap for even doing that, but I'm like, I'm not misgendering anybody. I'm not assuming gender. I'm just doing what is really easy to do in English. and use the non-gendered form of the noun that already exists in English. Like, so yeah. And I find that you get pushback about that sometimes. And it's weird because it's like an unforced social error. It's like, no, I'm just code switching. Like if I'm with a bunch of activists, I'll use the terms they use. But if I'm talking to the general public and I still want to respect that, I'm not going to use activist terms. I'm going to find approximations that do what they want, but the normal people aren't going to be called out by. Like,
it goes both ways. Like the R word, for example, the R slur is someone that, let's be real, I don't know, most people I know use it. Like behind closed doors. Like most people use it and they do not mean an actually mentally challenged person. They just use it like as a synonym for being like dumb or stupid or something, as a joke most of the time. But if I'm around someone who's going to be, I know would probably be offended by that, I'm just not going to use that term. You're being a dickhead. It's
Right.
very common sense. And there's that inverse logic to, like, if you're talking to somebody who might be more conservative or not share your beliefs, you're not going to use terms that are just unnecessarily going to push them away. And that's true just for like an everyday normal person, but also for a person who might be like, a thought leader on the right who you want to kind of challenge.
Yeah.
Even that too, because that's something also I notice people on the left they very don't like, that is the idea of talking to people who might be right of center. I get how there should be limitations. Like if someone on a certain politics has no intention whatsoever of you coexisting with them in their society, like outright neo-Nazis.
Yeah.
I don't really see what is useful about, debating a neo-Nazi. But if you have someone like Haz al-Din, for example, right? There's people who have mentioned that I should have him or Midwestern Marx on my show. And, there's a lot of people who are against that. And I kind of think, like, what is the real harm? Like, it's not like I'm going to be, I guess there's this fear that I'll be like seduced by their charms or something. And I feel like I don't think that's true of myself. And it's also kind of, it does, when people say that, usually the argument against platforming people like this is that you might seduce your audience. And I don't know. I feel like that is like assuming a very low level of intelligence on the audience.
I am very calculated on that. But in practice, I think, for example, if you were to have Haz al-Din on your show, I would not cancel you. I actually, in general, find those kind of tactics to be not very effective, particularly now. I think they actually start a mutually reinforcing feedback loop that actually helps people transition to the right pretty quickly. And I tend to think that the issue is, can you deal with the person in a way that both respects, and I do think to like talk to someone in that capacity, you have to have some ground of respect. So can you do that? And then, but also like is really honest about where your differences lie without it descending into a screaming match. And God bless Ben Burgess. I know he's a believer in debate. He's a friend of mine. So, I'm not insulting him here, but I have been sometimes you're too charitable with them. And other times, like you let it descend into a screaming match. Like I watched Daniel Tutt talk to Haz versus Ben Burgess talk to Haz, and it's radically different results because of how they went about the interview. It wasn't that Tutt dropped everything that he believed. And I listened to that interview with Haz and Daniel, and I thought it was fine. And in fact, Daniel asked me beforehand, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will, that, if I would hold it against him if he did it. And I was like, no, I've had Scott Horton on my show. Scott Horton is a right-wing libertarian. All right. I wanted to approach him about the way capital and empire works off. He gave me a lecture about how much socialism sucks. Never the 20-so meat, I suppose. But my audience was not converted to right-wing libertarianism. What they got from that is on a few very specific issues, they might be useful in an anti-war voting bloc, kind of, right? But that's fine. If you know that, that's what you have to do. The idea that you can have no compromise, and you're a group of at most a few thousand. And just to put that in scale, I like to remind people I think last time I checked, there's 332 million people in the United States. So, and no leftist group even breaks 100K. So, just to put it in terms of math, you need 1 million people to even be approaching like 1% of the population. So it is something to think about when we're thinking about this coalition building. My other advice, though, is some people take the wrong lesson from that, and they're like, "Oh, if we tail the right, we'll win them over." And I'm like, no one will trust you if you do that. If they think that you're putting on airs to win over their audience, but you're secretly going to change up what you believe, that of course they're not going to trust you. I mean, that's what Democrats do, and no one really trusts them either, even if they vote for them all the time. So
It usually just validates the right. Like I called this out with Jimmy
Mm-hmm.
Dore, as many people did, like early on. Now he's just a Trump supporter. Like Jimmy Dore, I always felt like that's the worst way to like I don't think he's turning right wingers leftward.
No.
He's just comes the guy for right wingers that he's like, that's the leftist I like.
Right.
He's like their Candace Owens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's basically what he is. And I think that's a big difference from engaging in debate, because like there's two consequences, I think, of not debating the right or not engaging with their ideas. Like the deplatforming method. There's two consequences of that. One, you end up kind of stupefying your audience in a way that like they can't handle contradictions. So when they have a person who is more rightward relative to where they are, they can't really deal with them in any other way other than calling them a fascist. And that does nothing to kind of de-radicalize them or move them in which you might believe is a better direction. It does nothing to do that. And when you only talk to you won't talk to them, you only talk to people of your own kind, that just pushes them forward. They feel like they can't go anywhere else. Like, so what's interesting is Slavoj Žižek. I don't think Slavoj Žižek has been pushed right. If you look at Slavoj Žižek's early work, he has always kind of had beliefs similar to what he has now. He's never been like this, like a real quote unquote Marxist. People hold him to this standard. He's always been like post-Marxist, But Žižek gave interesting answers to why he wrote for Compact Magazine. And he said no one else was willing to publish what I was writing. That says a lot. Like people get pushed in a certain way. Like if people become a pariah so easily, they are going to go rightward. Now, Žižek's smart enough to not like be just easily seduced by whatever fucking right-wing ideology comes his way because they happen to be nice to him. But a lot of people do go that way because politics is highly personal, right? And I see that all the time. We're probably thinking of a lot of different people.
You're probably thinking of people we might know. But
exactly.
Yeah, I think the right is both more and less pernicious than people realize. There are right attempts to infiltrate left groups and flip them over. That's very real. From a variety of tendencies, not even the weird ones. I mean, people think about Duginist or this, that, and the other. I mean, and Dugin says it explicitly in his fourth political theory that he wanted to call him Marxist. But it's not just them. I mean, all kinds of tendencies will try to do it. But I also think people miss that some of that stuff is sincere interest. I still have conservative friends, right? Like it's, sometimes it manifests in jokes about us putting each other in gulags or camps afterwards. I mean, it gets weird sometimes, not going to lie. But I also think I have to know what they think. And I also think you have to live in specific areas of the country to get away with, in some ways, being that clueless and tied off. Like, I live in Utah, man. Even in Salt Lake, which is basically a blue Gomorrah in one of the reddest states in the country. But like, I have to deal with conservatives on a daily basis. If I can't talk to them, if I can't conservative whisper, I'm in deep shit. If I lived in New York, I could avoid them all the time. but I don't, right? And in a country like the United States, if you want to viable any kind of politics, you have to be able to talk to a lot of people who do not have liberal assumptions or worldviews whatsoever without being condescending to them. Some of their worldviews are pretty ugly. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like, you go around and talk to some people, you find some scary shit. But like, if you can't do that, I don't know who you think you're going to win over when you're trying to speak to the masses, but you require a social code to speak that you actually have to be educated in your specific sectarian background to even know what the hell people are talking about. And I'm a guy who gets criticized for using too much jargon. I use it for very specific reasons because I'm talking about this or that tendency, and that's what they said, and I want to explain it to people. If I'm out in the world, that's not how I talk. And I think people have to get that. There's a general movement, and this is not just on the left, to be against code switching all of a sudden now. And, because it's onerous or it puts people in a bad spot, or it's only the elite culture who demands people code swift. And I think that's a way to just build where people can't communicate and expand their politics at all. I think it's a bad tendency. But yeah.
I do notice that in common, one thing that people like yourself have in common, like I would say you, Ben Studebaker, are leftists who are able to kind of engage with right-wing thought and are able to avoid a lot of these pitfalls you're describing with leftists, is that you come from red states. Like Studebaker comes from Indiana, I believe is Indiana. And, you have to deal with these people on a regular basis. And I think a big thing that characterizes a lot of leftists and why they can't, handle these sort of contradictions is urbanization. The fact that, you have a large amount of leftists who are disproportionately concentrated in urban areas. And that's something increasingly I've noticed, this urban-rural divide, or just more like an urban educated divide. And I want to ask you actually in the back room about this thing called the urban monoculture. A term that, I'll cut that out. A term that I think is important for situating the left a little bit because, I've just noticed it's such a stark difference. When you are in this urban area, you have a kind of, you're in a situation in which, one, there's not that many right-wingers, and you're exposed to a lot of cultural diversity, and the people who do have right-wing beliefs keep shut. Like, they are silent about them. So you have this idea that way more people agree with you than they actually do because people, can't speak a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say that's for the better. But it gives people a very distorted ideas how the majority thinks. And I think this is aggressive in Canada, this urban problem with the left, because like most of the Canadian left is so disproportionately concentrated in, big cities like Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, or, Edmonton, Winnipeg. Whereas that's not actually historically the left when it was at its biggest was in the West, in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, and even red, what I like to call red Texas, Alberta.
Yeah. Right. It is. So, no, Quebec is more like Texas historically, but
yeah.
I'd be curious to get into these figures we were talking about, like people who've shifted left, who've shifted right from the left in the back room, because
less slanderous that way.
Yeah. And if you're not part of the back room already, you can become one for as low as $5 instead of spending on another goddamn Starbucks latte. You can become a patron of One Time Radio. And happy to continue this conversation again. And check out Varn Vlog if you haven't already. I'm pretty sure a lot of regular One Time Radio listeners have. So see ya.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.